The rider came out of the dusk at a dead run, and everyone on the boardwalk outside Kingsley's Mercantile heard him before they saw him. A drumbeat of hooves on the hard-packed street that had not felt real rain in 11 weeks. Virginia Kingsley was locking the front door of her store when the horse skidded up in front of the water trough, and its rider pitched sideways out of the saddle, one hand pressed to his ribs, the other still clutching the reins as though letting go might undo everything he had ridden through to get there. "Ma'am," he gasped, and blood was black in the lamplight where it had soaked through his shirt and dried along his belt. "Ma'am, you have to warn them. The filings. Crane's got the filings and he's coming for the rest before anybody can." He did not finish. His knees buckled and he went down hard against the trough, and Virginia was already moving before she had decided to move, her skirts gathered in one hand, kneeling in the dust beside him with the practiced calm she had learned from her mother 20 years before on an Ohio kitchen table. "Somebody get Dr. Hale," she called out, though she already knew Dr. Hale had ridden out to the Prout Ranch that morning for a broken leg and would not be back before midnight. "Get me clean water and the whiskey from behind my counter, and somebody light more lamps." A shadow fell across her from the boardwalk, tall and quiet, and she did not have to look up to know it was Luke Wallace, because she had learned in the 8 months since he'd come to Cedar Springs that he moved like a man who had spent years training himself not to be heard until he wanted to be. "How bad?" he said. Not a question so much as a request for information, flat and even. "Bad enough. Help me get him inside onto the counter. We need it flat and out of this dust." Luke did not argue about whether the store counter, stacked with bolts of calico and tins of coffee, was the right place for a bleeding man. He simply swept an arm across it, sent goods clattering to the floor, and lifted the stranger as though he weighed nothing, carrying him through the door Virginia held open. Inside, under the brighter light of her hanging lamps, Virginia cut away the man's shirt with her sewing scissors and saw the wound was a graze along his lower ribs, ugly and deep enough to have bled him nearly dry, but not, she thought, a wound that should by itself have killed a healthy man of 30. It was the miles behind it that had nearly killed him. "Who did this to you?" Luke asked low. The man's eyes fluttered open, unfocused, fixing somewhere past Luke's shoulder. "Riders, 3 of them. Silas Crane's men out of North Platte. I worked the land office there under Warren Dodd, and I found the surveys, the real ones, not the ones filed. They mean to run the rail spur straight through Willow Creek and every claim along it, and they've been buying up water rights on paper that folks never sold, forging their marks." He coughed, and fresh blood came with it, and Virginia pressed a folded cloth hard against his side. "Rest your voice," she said. "You've said enough for now. We'll get the rest when you're stronger." "There isn't time," the man rasped. "They're an hour behind me, maybe less. I switched horses twice to gain that much. They mean to burn the papers I carried and anybody who's seen them." He reached weakly for his coat, hanging half off the counter's edge, and Virginia found the inside pocket torn but not empty, a leather satchel folded flat and slick with sweat, tied with cord. "That's it," he whispered. "Get it somewhere safe. My name is Amos Fielding. Tell the marshal in North Platte, tell somebody who still answers to the law honest." His eyes rolled back and his hand went slack, and for one terrible moment Virginia thought she had lost him, until she found the pulse at his throat, faint but steady, and let out a breath she had not known she was holding. "He's alive," she said. "Barely. Luke, I need you to ride to the Hendersons and bring back their boy. He's fast. Tell him to find Dr. Hale no matter what house call he has to interrupt, and somebody needs to watch that road." Luke Wallace looked at her for one long moment, and something in his face shifted, some old weight settling back onto shoulders that had clearly carried it before. "I'll watch the road myself," he said. "Bar your door behind me and keep that satchel out of sight." He was gone before she could ask how a carpenter who spent his days planing lumber and setting shelves had come to say a sentence like that with such certainty, as though he had said it 100 times in some other life, in some other town, wearing some other kind of authority than sawdust on his sleeves. Word ran through Cedar Springs faster than the drought-cracked ground could have carried water, and by the time 3 riders came down the road from the east with their horses lathered and their hat brims low, half the town had gathered lanterns and shotguns along the street, and Luke Wallace stood alone in the middle of it with a rifle held easy across his forearm, not raised, not lowered, simply present. The lead rider reined up 20 feet short of him, a barrel-chested man with a waxed mustache and a voice that carried the false friendliness of a man used to being obeyed. "Evening," the rider said. "We're looking for a man come through here on a bay gelding, hurt bad. Might have some papers on him that belong to my employer. No trouble intended, we just need what's his." "Nobody's come through tonight I know of," Luke said. "And even if they had, papers a man carries are his own business until a judge says otherwise. You're welcome to water your horses and move on." "That's a mighty particular kind of law you're quoting for a fellow with sawdust in his hair." "It's the only kind worth quoting," Luke answered, and did not move, and did not blink, and something about the stillness of him, the flat certainty in his voice, made the rider's horse shift under him as though it too sensed there was more behind those quiet gray eyes than the town's storekeepers and stage hands were used to seeing. The 3 riders exchanged a look. Whatever they decided in it, they turned their horses without another word and rode back east into the dark, and the town let out a breath it had been holding collectively for the better part of an hour. Virginia watched from her doorway, the satchel hidden beneath a bolt of muslin behind her counter, and found she had been holding her own breath too, watching a man she had thought she understood reveal an entirely different shape beneath the one she had known. Amos Fielding did not die that night, though it was 3 days before Dr. Hale would say so with any confidence, and in that time Virginia sat with him in the back room of her store more hours than she slept, changing dressings, spooning broth, listening for the fever to break. It was there, on the second night, with the lamp burned low and Luke Wallace posted quietly on an overturned crate by her back door, because he had simply appeared there after supper and not left, that Virginia finally asked him the question she had been turning over since the moment he'd stood alone against 3 armed strangers. "You were a lawman," she said. It was not a question either. The way Amos's first words to her had not been questions, and Luke seemed to appreciate that she had not made him confirm it as though it were some shameful secret. "Deputy United States Marshal," he said, "out of Dodge City and before that Ellsworth, 6 years. What happened?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer, but then he said, in that same flat, careful voice, "There was a rancher named Otto Halloran, wealthy, connected to men in Topeka who mattered to the men who'd appointed my marshal. Halloran drove his cattle across a dirt farmer's water claim during a dry summer not unlike this one, ruined the man's corn, and when the farmer put a fence up to stop him, Halloran's riders tore it down and beat the farmer half to death doing it. I arrested Halloran's foreman for the beating, had witnesses, had the doctor's report, had everything a court could want, and the judge, who owed his seat to men Halloran drank with, found a reason the witnesses weren't credible, and the foreman walked free inside a week, and I was told by my own marshal that arresting the farmer for building a fence on land he couldn't prove clear title to would settle the matter more quietly. I refused. I was told I could refuse myself right out of a badge, and I did." Virginia sat with that for a moment, the lamp hissing softly, Amos's breathing steady and slow behind them. "So you came here and became a carpenter?" "I came here because a man can build a shelf and know it's square or it isn't, know it'll hold weight or it won't, and nobody argues him out of the truth of it with a judge's favor." He looked at her then, and there was something almost embarrassed in it, a man unused to explaining himself. "Turns out even the plainest work still runs up against the same crookedness eventually. I suppose I should have expected that." "I suppose you should have," she said, but softly, and found she was smiling despite the gravity of the last 3 days, and he almost smiled back, and something passed between them in the lamplight that neither one of them had a name for yet, though both of them felt its weight. Cedar Springs in the summer of 1878 was a town built on stubbornness as much as anything. A cluster of frame buildings and sod additions strung along the stage road between North Platte and the western forts, its wells sinking lower every week of a drought that had cracked the earth into a map of its own suffering. Virginia's store was the beating heart of it, the place where news arrived before the newspapers did, where credit was extended on a widow's good judgment of a man's character, where Thomas Kingsley had built a life with her for 6 years before a typhoid fever took him 2 summers past and left her the mercantile, the debts, and a town full of men who seemed to believe a widow's grief had an expiration date convenient to their own courtship. She had refused Otis Prout, who ran cattle on the biggest spread west of town and wanted, she suspected, less a wife than a business partner who would fold his herds and her store together under his name. She had refused Harmon Beck, who managed the stage station and had proposed with the practical tenderness of a man discussing a merger, promising her she would never have to worry about the mercantile's accounts again once he was managing them for her. She had refused a traveling preacher, a cavalry lieutenant passing through on detached duty, and a widower farmer twice her age who had wanted, mostly, someone to cook. Each time the town had murmured that Virginia Kingsley was too proud, too particular, too used to running her own affairs to make a comfortable wife for any reasonable man, and each time she had gone home to the small rooms above her store and told herself she would rather be alone and whole than married and diminished. What she had not expected, in all her calculations of what she wanted and did not want, was a quiet man with sawdust on his boots who never once offered to take anything from her hands, who instead, in the weeks after Amos Fielding's arrival, simply appeared where he was useful and left when he was not, mending a hinge, replacing a cracked pane, saying little, watching everything, and somehow making her feel, for the first time in 2 years, that she was not entirely alone in carrying the weight of her own life. It was 10 days after the ambush that never came that Amos Fielding was strong enough to speak plainly, and Virginia gathered Luke and, at his insistence, the town's part-time constable, an aging former soldier named Silas Grigg, who mostly kept the peace between drunk cowhands and understood he was out of his depth with anything larger, into the back room to hear the whole of it. "Warren Dodd runs the district land office in North Platte," Amos said, sitting up now against a stack of pillows, his color returned though he still moved carefully. "He's been in Silas Crane's pocket 2 years, maybe longer. Crane represents the Prairie Central Railway Land Company, and Prairie Central wants the new branch line, the one that's supposed to connect the cattle towns south of here to the main line at North Platte, and they've decided the cheapest route runs straight through Willow Creek and the farms along it. That land's homesteaded," Virginia said. "Half those families have been there since '69. It is homesteaded, and that's the trouble for Crane, because condemning improved farms with water rights costs the railroad real money in compensation, money that mostly wouldn't go to Crane or Dodd. So instead they've been working the water claims. This drought's given them the excuse. Dodd's been filing paperwork saying certain water claims along Willow Creek were abandoned, unused past the legal term, which under the statute lets the land revert and be resold cheap to men who then sell it dear to the railroad once the survey's confirmed. Except the claims weren't abandoned. Dodd forged the affidavits. I saw them, side by side with the real filings, in his own office safe, because I've kept his books 3 years and I finally understood what I was looking at." "And when they caught you looking," Luke said, "Dodd's clerk saw me copying pages and told Crane's men before I could get clear of town. I barely got a horse saddled. They shot at me twice on the road and hit me the second time, out past Ogallala Crossing, but I'd already switched horses at the swing station, and I think in the dark they lost my trail for near an hour, which was enough." "Where's the original evidence now?" Virginia asked. "You said the satchel." "Copies," Amos said. "Not the originals. I couldn't get those out of the safe without Dodd noticing before I had to run, but enough cop it in my own hand, with dates, with the names of the men Crane sold the reverted claims to on paper. Cheap. Men who don't even farm, who exist only to sell again to the railroad once the route's confirmed. It's enough for a land office inspector to want to look harder, if it ever reaches one who isn't already bought. Luke had gone very still during this, the way Virginia had come to recognize as him turning something over completely before speaking, and when he did speak his voice had an edge she had not heard in it before. "There's a federal land inspector's circuit that comes through the district twice a year," he said. "Grant Ashford rode it when I was still wearing a badge, back before I left Kansas. Honest as they come, from what I knew of him then, though 4 years is enough time for a man to have changed. If he's still riding that circuit, and if we can get this evidence to him before the route's confirmed, before Crane covers his tracks any further, it might be enough." "How long before the route's confirmed?" Virginia asked. Amos shook his head slowly. "Dodd told Crane's foreman in my hearing they mean to finalize the survey and file the plat within 6 weeks. Once it's filed and confirmed, condemnation notices go out to whoever's left holding claims in the path, water rights or no, and there's precious little a small farmer can do to fight a filed federal survey in court, not against a railroad's lawyers, not in 6 months, let alone 6 weeks. 6 weeks, Virginia thought, looking at the satchel of copied pages sitting on her own kitchen table. 6 weeks to save every farm along Willow Creek, including, she realized with a chill, the very ground her own store sat on, since Cedar Springs itself lay directly in the surveyed path if the line ran where Amos said it would, following the creek's natural grade the way any sensible engineer would route it. Straight through the town's main street, and the mercantile that had been her husband's life's work and was now hers. She looked up and found Luke watching her, and understood he had already worked out the same thing and had been waiting to see if she would arrive at it herself before he said it. "They'd take the store too," she said. "They would," he said quietly. "Which means this isn't only Amos's fight, or the Jorgensens' fight, or the fight of every family up that creek. It's yours now as much as anybody's." "It was always going to be mine," she said, straightening her shoulders in a way he had already learned meant she had made a decision and did not intend to be argued out of it. "I just didn't know it yet." The next weeks passed in a strange doubled rhythm, ordinary days laid over an urgent secret one, Virginia keeping her store open through the worst of the summer heat, selling flour and calico and answering questions about the drought's toll on gardens and wells, while in the evenings she and Luke and sometimes Amos, once he could sit at a table without pain, worked through the copied pages by lamplight, cross-referencing names, building a case the way a woman builds a quilt. One careful piece fitted against the next until a pattern showed itself. It was in those evenings that Virginia came to know Luke Wallace as something other than the quiet carpenter the town had decided he was, learned that he read slowly but with total attention, that he had a dry humor that surfaced only when he trusted the company enough to risk it, that his hands, rough and scarred from years of both gun work and woodwork, moved with the same careful precision whether he was setting a hinge or turning the pages of a forged land claim looking for the tell of a false signature. "You're staring," he said one evening, not looking up from the page in front of him, and she realized she had been. "I'm thinking," she said, "that a man who left a marshal's badge over one dead conscience doesn't usually walk straight back toward the same kind of trouble without a second thought." "I had plenty of second thoughts," he said, "third and fourth ones too. And yet you're here every evening with your sleeves rolled up." He set the page down and looked at her directly, something unguarded in his face that made her breath catch slightly before she could stop it. "I told myself when I left Kansas I was done fighting other men's battles when the law wouldn't back me up. Then Amos Fielding fell off his horse in front of your store, and you knelt down in the dust to save a stranger without a second's hesitation, and I thought, there's a woman who doesn't wait to be told a thing's worth doing before she does it. Seemed a poor time to go on telling myself I was through with worthwhile trouble. That's the closest thing to a compliment you've paid me since the day we met, Virginia said, and was surprised to find her own voice a little unsteady. I've paid you plenty of compliments, Luke said. You've just been too busy running your store in half this town to notice. She laughed then, Chinese letter, a real laugh, the first one in longer than she could easily remember, and it startled them both. And for a moment the papers and the drought and the 6 weeks ticking down did not exist at all. Only the lamplight and the sound of her own laughter, and the way Luke Wallace was looking at her, as though he had been waiting a long while to hear it. The moment did not last, because moments like that rarely do on a frontier where trouble kept its own schedule. And 3 days later a boy came riding hard into Cedar Springs from the Jorgensen place out past Willow Creek, breathless, saying Ingrid Jorgensen's time had come early and something was wrong. The midwife from Ogallala was 2 days off tending another birth, and would Mrs. Kingsley come, please? Because everyone knew Mrs. Kingsley had trained under her mother, and had caught more babies safely in this county than anyone since old Dr. Hale's wife had passed. Virginia was already reaching for her bag of instruments, the leather satchel her own mother had given her, before the boy finished speaking. "How far along is Willow Creek from here by wagon?" she asked, though she knew the answer, 12 miles, most of it fine road. But the last 3 ran through a stretch of broken bluff and canyon country the locals called Ash Hollow Crossing, where the stage road narrowed between rock walls before it dropped down toward the creek bottoms, a stretch that had never bothered anyone before this summer, except that now it was exactly the kind of ground where 3 riders could sit above the road unseen and wait. Luke was already saddling 2 horses by the time she came out of the store with her bag. "You don't have to come," she said, though she said it already knowing he would. "I know I don't have to," he said. "I'm coming anyway. If Crane's men are watching any road out of this town, it's that one because it's the only way through to the claims they mean to steal. I've made this ride alone a dozen times, Luke. Not this summer, and not with what we both know now." He swung up onto his horse and looked down at her, not with the possessiveness of Otis Prout or Harmon Beck, she noticed, but with something more like a plain statement of fact he trusted her to weigh fairly. "You can tell me to stay behind and I'll stay, if that's truly your wish. But I'd rather ride beside you and be wrong to worry than let you ride alone and be right too." She studied him a long moment, feeling the old instinct rise in her, the one that had carried her through 2 years of widowhood and a dozen refused proposals, the instinct that said accepting a man's protection was the first step toward losing herself to his terms. But she thought of Amos Fielding bleeding out on her counter, and of 3 riders sitting easy in their saddles asking after papers that belonged to a dying man, and she understood, perhaps for the first time in 2 years, that there was a difference between surrendering herself to a man and simply allowing herself to be less alone. "Ride beside me then," she said, "but you'll follow my lead on the delivery itself. I've caught 40 babies in this county. You've caught none." "Fair terms," Luke said, and something in his eyes, relief mixed with respect, told her she had answered correctly for both of them. They made the ride to Willow Creek without incident, arriving as the sun dropped low and gold over the bluffs, and found Ingrid Jorgensen in hard labor, her husband Nils pale and useless with worry in the doorway of their sod house. 3 other children herded into a corner by the eldest daughter, who was not yet 12 but had clearly done this before with younger siblings. The birth was difficult, the baby turned wrong, and Virginia worked through the night with her sleeves rolled to the elbow, and her voice pitched low and calm even when her hands, beneath the calm, moved with the quick decisive certainty of a woman who had done this exact fight against death a dozen times before, and intended to win it again. Luke, banished from the room itself, spent the hours boiling water, keeping the younger children fed and distracted with a set of wooden toy animals he whittled from kindling by lamplight while they watched wide-eyed, and twice at Virginia's call bringing her precisely what she asked for without a single question. learning in those hours the particular kind of usefulness that came not from taking charge, but from simply being ready. Near dawn, the baby came, small and furious and entirely alive, and Ingrid Jorgensen wept with relief, while Nils stood in the doorway with tears cutting tracks through the dust on his face. And Virginia, exhausted and glowing with the particular joy of her work well done, looked up to find Luke standing just behind her holding a lamp steady without being asked, and understood that whatever she felt for him had grown in these last weeks into something she could no longer pretend was merely gratitude for a neighbor's help. "You did that," Luke said quietly, once the baby was wrapped and settled, and the exhausted family finally sleeping in the gray light before full dawn. "Nobody helped you do that but you. You kept 3 children calm and fed all night and never once told me how to do my work," Virginia said. "That's more help than most men in this county would know how to give." "I learned a long time ago," Luke said, "that the surest way to be useless to somebody is to insist on being necessary." They rode back toward Cedar Springs in the full light of morning, tired in the pleasant way of a hard job finished well, and it was Nils Jorgensen's eldest boy, riding out ahead of them to fetch water from a spring near the crossing, who came galloping back white-faced to tell them smoke was rising from the direction of town, a great deal of it, black and thick against the pale drought sky. They pushed the horses hard through Ash Hollow Crossing, the same narrow stretch of bluff and rock Virginia had worried over the evening before, and came out the far side to see, from 2 miles off, that the smoke rose directly from the heart of Cedar Springs, from the block where her store stood, and she felt something cold and terrible drop through her chest even before Luke, riding half a length ahead, called back over his shoulder that it looked like it might already be past saving. They arrived to find half the town's able-bodied men and women still fighting the last of the flames with buckets from the town well and the trough, though it was clear from the collapsed roof and the blackened frame that the fire had done its work before anyone had even known to start fighting it. Harmon Beck, soot-streaked and grim, met them at the edge of the crowd. "Started sometime after midnight," he said. "Nobody saw who said it, but somebody used coal oil. You can smell it in what's left. Whole back rooms gone, front counters gone, most everything on the shelves burned or smoke ruined." Virginia slid down from her horse and stood very still, looking at the wreckage of 6 years of her life with Thomas, and then 2 years of her life alone, reduced to a smoking black frame and the smell of char. And for one long moment she said nothing at all, because there was nothing in her that had words ready for a loss this size. "Amos," she said finally, sharply, remembering. "Where's Amos Fielding? He was resting in the back room. He's safe," Harmon said quickly. "Silas Grigg got him out early, moved him to the Baptist parsonage 2 nights back on account of he was strong enough to be moved, and Grigg didn't like how many strangers had been through town asking after the mercantile. Man's fine," Virginia, shaken but fine. Relief cut through her grief for a moment, sharp and clean, but the grief came back all the same, standing in the ashes of everything her husband had built and she had kept alive, and it was Luke who came to stand beside her then, not speaking, not offering empty comfort, simply present, the way he had been present that first night when 3 riders had come asking after a dying man's papers. "They wanted to frighten you into selling," he said finally, quiet enough that only she could hear it over the crowd's noise, "or frighten you into leaving. Either way, they've shown their hand plainer than they meant to, because an honest railroad company doesn't burn a widow's store to clear a survey line. That's the kind of evidence Amos's papers alone could never give us. That's a cold comfort for a burned store, Luke Wallace." "I know it," he said. "I'm not offering it as comfort. I'm offering it as a promise. We'll rebuild what they burned, and we'll bring the men who did it down with the very evidence they were trying to keep buried. Both things. Not one instead of the other." She looked at the wreckage a moment longer, and then at him, and found in his face none of the pity she had dreaded, none of the calculation she'd seen in Otis Prute's eyes when he'd once mentioned, almost in passing, how much easier her life would be with a strong man's name behind her business. There was only a plain, steady resolve, the look of a man stating a fact about the future the way he might state that a beam was sound or a joint would hold. That evening, as the ashes cooled and the town's shock settled into a low, simmering anger against whoever had done this to Thomas Kingsley's widow, Otis Prout found Virginia sitting on an overturned crate near what had been her front step, and made the offer she had known someone eventually would. "I'll buy the lot from you outright," he said, not unkindly, crouching down to her eye level with his hat in his hands. "Fair price, more than fair, enough you could take rooms in North Platte and never worry about rebuilding anything with your own 2 hands. Nobody would think less of you for it, Virginia. A woman alone, burned out twice in one lifetime by trouble not of her making. There's no shame in walking away from ground that clearly doesn't want you on it." "The ground didn't set that fire, Otis," she said, more tired than angry. "A man did, and I have no intention of rewarding him by handing over what he wanted badly enough to burn for. It's not about reward, it's about sense. I appreciate the offer," Virginia said, standing, brushing ash from her skirt with a finality that ended the conversation more clearly than any words could have. "I do. But I buried my husband on this ground, and I've delivered half the babies in this county from a bag I keep behind that counter, or I did, and I am not leaving it because somebody with more money than conscience decided I should." Otis straightened, disappointed but not, she thought, entirely surprised, and left her alone with the ashes and the darkening sky. And it was perhaps 20 minutes later, in the last gray light of evening, that she noticed Luke Wallace measuring the burned foundation with a length of knotted cord, jotting figures onto a scrap of paper by the light of a lantern hung from a fence post, entirely absorbed in the work as though the town around him did not exist. "What are you doing?" she asked, coming to stand beside him. "Measuring," he said simply. "Foundation's mostly sound, stone doesn't burn easy, and the well behind it's untouched. I can have a frame up inside 3 weeks if the lumber comes in on schedule from North Platte, faster if half this town pitches in the way I expect they will once I ask. Luke, I haven't the money right now to pay a builder. I didn't ask you for money," he said, not looking up from his figures. "I'm not offering to build you a store because I expect payment for it, Virginia. I'm offering because it needs building, and I know how to build it, and because I have thought for some weeks now that watching you refuse every man in this county who's offered to solve your problems for you has been the most interesting thing that's happened to me in 3 years, and I find I would rather help you solve this one than watch you carry it alone out of pure stubborn pride." She stood very still, feeling something in her chest crack open in a way it had not since Thomas died, something that was not quite grief and not quite relief but some new thing entirely, and she found her voice came out rougher than she intended. "That's not asking me to hand anything over. That's different from what Otis offered." "It's meant to be different," Luke said, finally looking up at her, his gray eyes steady in the lantern light. "I'm not offering to take this place off your hands, Virginia. I'm offering to help you keep it standing under your own name, with your own hands still on the counter, if you'll let me swing a hammer alongside you instead of doing your worrying for you." "Then yes," she said before she had entirely decided to say it, and found she did not regret the speed of it at all. "Build with me, not for me, with me." "With you," he agreed, and something like the beginning of a smile crossed his face. And for the first time since the smoke had risen over Cedar Springs that morning, Virginia Kingsley felt something in her chest that was not entirely made of ash. The rebuilding of Kingsley's mercantile became, over the following weeks, the closest thing Cedar Springs had to a shared purpose that whole drought-stricken summer, as though the town, starved of rain and worried sick over water claims it could not control, had decided to pour every ounce of its frustration into something it could fix with its own hands. Farmers who could ill afford a day away from their withering fields came anyway to help raise the frame. The blacksmith donated nails at cost. Ingrid Jorgensen, still recovering from childbirth, sent preserves and bread by wagon every few days so the workers would not go hungry, her way of repaying a debt she considered unpayable any other way. Luke ran the work the way Virginia imagined he must once have run a posse, calm, precise, never raising his voice, correcting a badly cut joint with a patience that made the correction feel like teaching rather than criticism. And Virginia found herself, more often than not, standing at his elbow with her sleeves rolled up same as any of the men, learning to true a wall with a plumb line, learning the particular satisfaction of driving a nail home clean on the first strike, learning that a woman could build with her own hands and lose nothing of herself in the doing, only gain. It was on an evening 2 weeks into the rebuilding, the frame fully raised and the roof half shingled, that Luke found her alone inside the skeleton of the new building, running her palm along a stud he had planed smooth that afternoon, and something in the quiet of the evening, the two of them alone for the first time in days without Amos or Grigg or a dozen helping neighbors between them, made the air feel suddenly charged in a way that had nothing to do with drought or fraud or railroads at all. "It's going to be a fine store," she said, not quite trusting herself to look at him directly. "It's going to be a finer store than the one they burned," Luke said. "Wider counter. Better light through the west windows come afternoon. I hope you don't mind I took a few liberties with the original plan." "I don't mind at all." She finally looked at him, and found he was already looking at her, closer than she had realized, close enough that she could see the fine grain of sawdust caught in the lines beside his eyes, close enough that the careful distance they had both maintained for weeks, out of caution or courtesy or simple fear of moving too fast toward something neither had asked for, seemed suddenly, foolishly small. "Virginia," he said, and her name in his voice sounded different than it ever had from anyone else's mouth, weighted and careful, like something he had turned over in his hands many times before deciding it was safe to hold. "Luke, I told myself when I started this that I was building you a store because it needed building and I had the skill for it, and that was true as far as it went. But it's not the whole truth, and I find I'm tired of being a man who only tells half of things." "What's the whole truth, then?" Her voice had gone soft, unsteady, and she did not try to hide it. "The whole truth is I have thought about very little besides you, since the night Amos Fielding fell off that horse in front of your door. I have watched you refuse men who wanted to take your independence from you piece by piece disguised as kindness, and I have been half sick with fear that if I ever told you how I felt, you would hear it as one more man wanting to manage your life for you, and I would rather live the rest of my days saying nothing than be one more weight added to everything you've already had to carry alone." Virginia felt her eyes sting unexpectedly, and reached up to touch the side of his face, rough with a day's beard, warm under her palm. "You have never once tried to manage me, Luke Wallace, not once in all these weeks. You have stood beside me while I did the managing myself, and that has made all the difference in the world. Then may I say plainly what I feel without you hearing it as a demand?" "You may." "I love you," he said simply, the way he said everything, without ornament, without performance, as though it were a fact as solid and undeniable as a load-bearing beam. "I have loved you for weeks now, and I expect I'll go on loving you a good deal longer than that, and I am not asking you for anything in return except the chance to keep standing beside you, building whatever needs building, for as long as you'll have me there." "I love you too," Virginia said, and it came out on something between a laugh and a sob, relief and joy tangled together, after 2 years of careful loneliness she had told herself was strength. "I have for longer than I've been willing to admit, even to myself. I kept thinking, here is the one man in this county who has never once asked me to be smaller than I am, and I did not know what to do with that, because it frightened me more than any proposal Otis Prout ever made." "I'm not asking you to be smaller," Luke said, drawing her gently closer, his hands warm at her waist. "I'm asking you to let me build alongside you. That's all this ever was from the first nail." "Then build alongside me," she said, "and kiss me now before I lose my nerve and start arguing about the terms." He laughed then, low and real, and kissed her there in the half-finished frame of her rebuilt store, with the smell of fresh-cut pine around them and the last light of evening slanting gold through the studs that would soon be walls. And Virginia Kingsley, merchant's widow, midwife, refuser of every suitor the county had sent her way, felt for the first time in 2 long years entirely, gladly, undiminished, unafraid. Their happiness did not have long to breathe before the world outside the half-built store demanded their attention again, because 3 days later a rider from North Platte brought word that changed the shape of everything still ahead of them. The rider was a young clerk from the district land office, not one of Crane's men but a nervous, decent boy named Peter Voss who had worked alongside Amos Fielding and had grown sick with guilt over his own silence in the months since Amos's flight. He found Luke at the store site and delivered his news in a low, hurried voice, glancing over his shoulder as though Crane's shadow might fall across him even here. "Inspector Ashford is riding the district circuit early this year," Peter said, "on account of complaints reaching Lincoln about irregular water claim reversals across 3 counties, not just this one. He's expected in North Platte inside 2 weeks, and word is Dodd and Crane mean to have the survey plat filed and confirmed before he arrives, so there's nothing left for him to inspect but a done deed." 2 weeks, Luke said, and Virginia, standing nearby with a hammer still in her hand, felt the number land in her chest like a stone. "There's more," Peter said. "Crane knows about the copies Amos took, or suspects it strongly enough to act as though he knows. He's hired 2 more men from Cheyenne, gun hands, not surveyors, and he's had them asking after a carpenter and a storekeeping widow in Cedar Springs, who might be holding papers that don't belong to them. They mean to take the evidence by force before Ashford arrives," Virginia said, "or destroy whoever holds it," Peter said, unable to meet her eyes. "I'm sorry, ma'am, I should have come sooner, I was afraid." "You came," Virginia said, more gently than she felt. "That's more than most men in your position would have managed. Thank you." After Peter had gone, promising to send word the moment he learned Ashford's exact route and schedule, Luke and Virginia sat together on a stack of fresh lumber in the gathering dusk, the unfinished store rising around them like a promise not yet kept, and worked through what remained to be done. "We can't wait 2 weeks and hope Ashford simply happens to look in the right direction," Luke said. "We need to reach him before he ever gets to North Platte, put the evidence directly in his hands somewhere Crane can't intercept it, and we need enough corroborating witnesses, Nils Jorgensen, the other Willow Creek families, Amos himself once he's fit to travel, that Ashford has no honest choice but to halt the survey filing and investigate properly. Where's Ashford riding from before North Platte? Last I knew his circuit, 4 years back, ran up from Ogallala through the Ash Hollow country before turning north. If that pattern holds, we could meet him on the road itself, well clear of Dodd's office and any of Crane's usual ground. Through Ash Hollow," Virginia said slowly. "The same crossing we rode through the night the store burned." "The same," Luke said, and something in both their faces acknowledged, without needing to say it aloud, that if Crane's hired men wanted a place to catch 2 people carrying dangerous evidence on a lonely stretch of road, they could hardly find better ground than a narrow canyon crossing where the bluffs rose close on either side, and a rider below could be seen by a rider above long before the reverse was true. "Then we go carefully," Virginia said, "and we go together, because Amos is still too weak to ride hard, and I won't leave him and Ingrid and half of Willow Creek's future in the hands of anyone less determined than the 2 of us." "Together," Luke agreed, and reached for her hand, and in the fading light his grip was warm and sure, and Virginia thought that whatever waited for them on the road ahead, she had rather face it beside this steady, quiet man than safe and alone in any life Otis Prout or Harmon Beck could have offered her. They set out 4 days later. Once word came from Peter Voss that Inspector Ashford had indeed left Ogallala and was expected to cross toward North Platte within 3 days' time, likely along the old stage road through Ash Hollow. Virginia rode with the satchel of copied evidence bound tight against her body beneath her coat, and with her, alongside Luke, came Nils Jorgensen, insistent on bearing witness himself despite Ingrid's worry, and Amos Fielding, pale but stubborn, riding slow but riding all the same, because he had said plainly that he had bled for these papers once already, and did not intend to let anyone else carry the risk of delivering them without him. They made good time the first day, camping that night in a shallow draw well off the main road, and it was near midday on the second day, as the road narrowed between the pale, sun-bleached bluffs of Ash Hollow Crossing, that Luke, riding a length ahead as he always did through tight ground, suddenly reined up hard and lifted a hand for silence. "Dust," he said quietly, nodding toward a rise on the canyon's south rim, where a thin curl of pale dust hung in the still, dry air, betraying riders moving along ground no honest traveler had reason to use. "How many?" Virginia asked, already feeling her pulse quicken, her hand going instinctively to the satchel beneath her coat. "Can't say for certain. Enough that I don't like our odds if they mean to come down on us in this stretch." Luke's eyes swept the canyon walls with the swift, assessing focus she remembered from the night 3 riders had first come asking after Amos, and she understood she was watching the lawman resurface fully now, every instinct honed by 6 years of frontier work. "There's a dry wash," Nils Jorgensen said suddenly, surprising them all. "I hunted through this country 2 summers back, before my claim was settled. Runs off the main crossing maybe a quarter-mile ahead, cuts down through the bluff and comes out below, near the old Buffalo Ford. Rough going, but a horse can manage it if it's careful." "Would riders unfamiliar with this ground know of it?" Luke asked. "Crane's men are hired out of Cheyenne from what Peter said. Cattle country, not this broken ground. I'd wager my last dollar they don't know that wash exists." "Then that's our road," Luke said, already turning his horse. "Virginia, stay close behind me. Amos, you next. Nils, you know the wash. You'll need to lead once we reach it. Move quiet as you can and fast as you dare." They had covered perhaps 200 yards toward the hidden turning when a rifle shot cracked off the canyon wall above them, kicking dust a few feet wide of Amos's horse, and a voice rang out from the rim, rough and confident. "Hold up there. We've got the high ground in the numbers, and all we want is what the woman's carrying. Hand it over and nobody needs to bleed for it." "Ride," Luke said, low and urgent, not slowing to answer the challenge, and the small group broke into a hard gallop along the narrowing canyon floor as 2 more shots cracked overhead, deliberately high warning shots meant to frighten rather than kill, at least for now, while the riders above scrambled to find an angle for something more final. Virginia's heart hammered as she rode, one hand tight on the reins, the other pressed against the satchel beneath her coat as though her own body could shield it, and ahead of her Nils Jorgensen suddenly wheeled his horse hard right, into what looked like nothing more than a crack in the canyon wall, a shadowed gap barely wide enough for a single rider. "Here, follow me close, mind the loose rock near the bottom." They plunged into the wash one after another, the canyon walls closing in tight enough that Virginia could have reached out and touched stone on either side, the light dimming to a cool blue shade, the ground beneath uneven and treacherous with loose scree that sent her horse skidding twice before catching purchase again. Behind them, muffled now by the twisting rock, she heard shouts of confusion, the pursuers reaching the place where the group had vanished from the main crossing and finding no obvious trail to follow. "They'll lose time working out where we've gone," Luke called back over his shoulder, "but not forever. Keep moving." The wash dropped steadily, twisting between walls that pressed close and then opened briefly into small sandy hollows before narrowing again, and twice they had to dismount and lead the horses over jumbled rock falls too treacherous to ride. Virginia's hands scraped raw, her breath coming hard, but always Luke was there beside her at the difficult places, steadying her elbow, taking her horse's reins for the worst of the scrambles, never once suggesting she could not manage it herself. Only making certain She did not have to manage it alone. They emerged, finally, into full sunlight above the old Buffalo Ford Nils had promised, a wide, shallow crossing of the North Platte's dry summer channel, and beyond it, unmistakably, a small column of riders moving steadily along the main road from the west, too disciplined and too well provisioned to be anyone but a Federal Circuit party. "That's Ashford," Luke said, relief plain in his voice for the first time since the shots had rung out. "Has to be. Nobody else rides this stretch with that kind of order." They crossed the ford at a hard trot and reached the column within a quarter hour, and Inspector Grant Ashford, a lean, weathered man of perhaps 50 with sharp, careful eyes, listened to Luke's introduction with visible surprise before recognition dawned. "Wallace, Luke Wallace out of Dodge City, unless I'm very much mistaken." "You're not mistaken, sir. It's been 4 years. "It has. I'd heard you left the service under a cloud you didn't deserve. Glad to see you landed somewhere still breathing." Ashford's eyes moved over the rest of the group, taking in Virginia's coat, the satchel now openly in her hands, Amos's pale, determined face, Nils's road dust and rifle. "I take it this isn't a chance meeting." "No, sir, it isn't," Luke said. "And what we have to show you can't wait for North Platte, because the men who'd rather you never saw it have already tried twice today to make certain you didn't." Inspector Ashford's camp that evening, established in a defensible hollow well back from the road with his own armed circuit riders standing careful watch, became the setting for the telling of the whole affair from its beginning, Amos Fielding laying out the forged affidavits and true surveys side by lamplight, Nils Jorgensen speaking plainly of water his family had used without interruption for 9 years, suddenly declared abandoned on paper he had never signed. Virginia describing the fire that had taken her store the same week. The fraud's existence became known beyond North Platte's borders. Ashford listened without interrupting, his weathered face giving away little, but when Amos finished he sat back and exhaled slowly. "This isn't the first complaint of its kind I've carried this circuit," he said, "but it's the first with evidence solid enough to stand against Dodd's office directly, assuming these copies match the originals in his safe, which I intend to confirm myself before I'm through. Mr. Fielding, are you prepared to swear to this before witnesses in a formal hearing?" "I am," Amos said. "I bled for it once already. I'll not flinch from swearing to it." "Then here is what I propose," Ashford said. "I will not simply confirm or deny this route on my own authority in some quiet office where Crane's money might still find a way to reach me. I will call a public hearing in Cedar Springs itself, since it's the town most directly threatened, and I will hear the evidence and the testimony of every affected family openly, before the whole community, with the survey plat and Dodd's affidavits produced for comparison. If Crane's fraud is what you say it is, it will not survive daylight and public witness. And if by some chance I am wrong about the honesty of what you've shown me tonight, that same public hearing will protect Dodd and Crane from being condemned unfairly. Either way, the truth deserves an audience larger than my own tent." "When?" Virginia asked. 9 days from now. That gives time to notify every family along Willow Creek, and time enough that Crane cannot claim he was denied fair notice to answer these charges himself. It also, Mr. Wallace," Ashford added, with the faint ghost of a smile, "gives you time to finish rebuilding whatever it is Crane's men burned down, since I understand from your friend here that the hearing itself might as well be held in the very store they meant to destroy." They rode back toward Cedar Springs the following morning under Ashford's protection for the first stretch parting ways where the circuit turned north, and the 9 days that followed passed in a blur of urgent, purposeful work. The last of the store's shingles nailed down, the counter set and sanded smooth, word carried to every homestead along Willow Creek that the hearing would decide, once and for all, whether their claims and their homes would stand or be swept aside by a railroad's fraudulent convenience. Silas Crane, when word reached him of the coming hearing, did not simply retreat, and 2 nights before the appointed day, One of his hired Cheyenne guns was caught by Silas Griggs' watchful eye trying to slip into the half-finished store after dark, and only Luke's swift arrival, roused from a light sleep by Griggs' shout, prevented the man from putting a match to what little remained unfinished. The man was taken into custody, and under Ashford's authority, extended by wire to Grigg for the occasion, questioned closely enough that he admitted, in exchange for leniency, that Crane had ordered him to destroy the store a second time, and failing that, to be prepared to disrupt the hearing itself by force if the evidence looked likely to hold. "He means to come to the hearing with more men than we've got," Luke said grimly, the morning before it was set to begin, standing with Virginia in the finished front room of the rebuilt mercantile, its shelves freshly stocked with what goods could be replaced in time, its counter gleaming with fresh varnish. Ashford's brought only 2 circuit riders with him. If Crane arrives with 6 or 8 hired guns, meaning to intimidate the room into silence, or worse, we'll need more than paperwork to see this through peacefully. "Then we ask the town," Virginia said simply. "Every homesteader along Willow Creek has more at stake in this than fear of a few hired guns from Cheyenne. Nils Jorgensen will come. Otis Prout, for all his faults, would rather see Crane fail than see his own grazing land threatened by the same fraud eventually. Harmon Beck has more courage than his careful proposals ever let on. We ask them all to stand present, armed if need be, not to start a fight, but to make plain that this town will not be bullied silent in its own rebuilt store." Luke studied her a long moment, and something like pride mixed with tenderness crossed his face. "You've become a formidable strategist for a storekeeper, Virginia Kingsley." "I've had a formidable teacher these last months," she said, "though I notice he still hasn't told me how he plans to handle martial duties without a badge to back his authority, should Crane's men decide paperwork alone won't stop them." "About that," Luke said, and reached into his coat, producing a folded letter bearing an official seal. "Ashford wired ahead to the district marshal's office 2 days past, on my recommendation and his own judgment of the danger. As of this morning, I am once again a duly commissioned Deputy United States Marshal for this district, appointed specifically to keep order at tomorrow's proceedings." Virginia felt her breath catch, understanding all at once what this meant, not merely for the hearing but for the man standing before her, the weight of a badge he had once walked away from in disgust now settling back onto his shoulders by his own choice, in a fight he had chosen to believe in. "How does it feel," she asked softly, "wearing that again?" "Different," he admitted. "Last time I wore it, I learned the law could be twisted into something that protected the wealthy and punished the poor for the crime of defending themselves. This time, I mean to see it used the way it was meant to be used from the start, to protect people who have nothing to defend themselves with but the truth. I find I don't mind carrying it, so long as I'm carrying it toward that." The morning of the hearing dawned clear and already hot, the drought showing no sign of breaking even as the town's fortunes hung in the balance, and by 9 o'clock the rebuilt mercantile's front room, its shelves pushed back to make space for benches borrowed from the church, was packed with more people than Cedar Springs had gathered in one place since the 4th of July, Willow Creek families standing shoulder to shoulder with townsfolk. Otis Prout and Harmon Beck, seated near the front with rifles kept discreetly, but visibly across their laps, Nils Jorgensen holding little Ingrid's hand tight beside their newborn daughter, sleeping in a basket at their feet. Inspector Ashford sat at a table set up before the counter, Dodd's original land office ledgers, subpoenaed under federal authority 2 days prior and delivered under armed escort, spread open before him alongside Amos Fielding's careful copies, and Warren Dodd himself sat pale and sweating in a chair to one side, having been compelled to attend under threat of federal charges should he refuse. Silas Crane arrived precisely as the hearing was called to order, striding through the door with the easy confidence of a man who had never once in his life expected consequences to catch him, 4 hard-eyed men trailing behind him, and it was Luke Wallace, badge now pinned openly to his vest, who stepped into the doorway and stopped them there. "Mr. Crane is welcome to attend," Luke said, in a voice that carried clear through the crowded room without needing to be raised. "His hired men will wait outside. This is a hearing, not a show of force, and I will not have it turned into one." Crane's men shifted, glancing toward their employer, and for one taut moment the room held its breath, until Crane, calculating the crowd's numbers and the plain fact that even his own men looked uneasy at the prospect of drawing on a federal deputy in front of 24 armed homesteaders, waved his men back with poorly concealed irritation. "No need for theatrics, Marshal," Crane said smoothly, stepping inside alone. "I've nothing to hide from an honest inquiry." "Then let's have the honest inquiry," Ashford said, and the hearing began. It lasted the better part of the day, Amos Fielding testifying first, his voice steady despite the visible effort it cost him, laying out precisely how he had discovered the discrepancy between Dodd's filed abandonment affidavits and the true, continuously worked water claims along Willow Creek. Nils Jorgensen followed, describing in halting but firm English the 9 unbroken years his family had drawn water from the very claim Dodd's paperwork declared abandoned, and 3 other homesteaders after him told similar stories, each one chipping away further at the fiction Crane and Dodd had built. Warren Dodd, confronted directly by Ashford with his own ledger entries beside Amos's copies, the forged signatures plain and clumsy under close comparison, broke within the hour, admitting under the weight of federal charges hanging over him that Crane had paid him $200 a claim to falsify the abandonment records, and that the men who had purchased the reverted claims cheap were, every one of them, either employees of the Prairie Central Railway Land Company or relatives of its officers, never intending to farm an acre of it, existing only as a paper conduit to sell the land back to the railroad itself at inflated value once the survey confirmed the route. Crane, when it came his turn, attempted first denial, then indignant outrage, then, as the accumulated evidence made both untenable, a final desperate offer, delivered in a lowered voice meant only for Ashford's ears but overheard by half the front row, to settle matters quietly with a generous payment toward the inspector's discretion. Ashford's response, delivered loud enough for the entire room to hear plainly, ended whatever chance Crane had left of salvaging the day. "Mr. Crane, you have just offered a bribe to a federal officer in the presence of 24 witnesses and a deputy marshal. I believe that settles rather conclusively any question this hearing might have had about your character, or the honesty of the survey you've been so eager to see confirmed." He turned to Luke. "Marshal Wallace, I believe you have grounds now to take Mr. Crane into custody, pending formal charges of land fraud, forgery, and attempted bribery of a federal official." Crane's composure finally cracked, and for one dangerous instant his hand twitched toward the pistol at his belt, and the room went utterly silent, every eye fixed on the small, terrible space between a desperate man and the badge standing calm and unhurried before him. "Don't," Luke said, quiet, almost gentle, though his own hand had come to rest, easy but ready, near his own holster. "You've lost this fight fair and square in front of your own witnesses, Crane. Don't make the mistake of thinking a second crime will undo the first. Take your hand off that pistol, and let's finish this the way the law's supposed to work, without anybody bleeding for it." Whatever calculation ran behind Crane's eyes in that stretched, silent moment, self-preservation won out over pride, and his hand fell away from the pistol, and he stood, shoulders slumping. All his earlier confidence collapsed into the plain, unglamorous posture of a beaten man, while Luke stepped forward and took him into custody without a shot fired, without a fist raised. The whole confrontation settled by nothing more than steady nerve, and the unmistakable weight of truth finally spoken aloud in a room full of people who had waited months to hear it. Inspector Ashford, once order was restored, delivered his ruling from the same table where the evidence had been laid bare, his voice carrying easily to every corner of the crowded room. "By the authority vested in me as inspector of the General Land Office for this district," he said, "I hereby declare the survey plat filed by Warren Dodd's office for the proposed Prairie Central branch line null and void, on grounds of fraud in the underlying water claim reversals upon which that survey's route was justified. All water claims declared abandoned along Willow Creek within the past 18 months are hereby restored in full to their original holders. I will personally recommend to the General Land Office in Washington that any future survey for this branch line be conducted under direct federal oversight, following the natural grade east of Willow Creek entirely, well clear of every homesteaded claim in this valley, including the town of Cedar Springs itself." The room erupted, not into chaos but into something warmer, homesteaders embracing one another, Ingrid Jorgensen weeping openly against her husband's shoulder, Harmon Beck and Otis Prout shaking hands with a warmth neither man had shown the other in years. And through the middle of it all Virginia Kingsley stood very still behind the counter of her rebuilt store. Watching Luke Wallace lead a defeated Sila's crane out through the front door toward whatever wagon would carry him to face federal charges in North Platte, and felt, for the first time in longer than she could easily measure, that the ground beneath her feet, and beneath every family she loved in this valley, was finally, truly, hers to keep. It was 3 days later, the last of the hearing's business concluded, Crane and Dodd both remanded to federal custody in North Platte pending trial, that Luke came to find her in the quiet of an ordinary evening, the store closed for the night, the two of them alone amid shelves finally settled into their proper order, and he did not, this time, need to search for words the way he once might have. "Virginia," he said, "I have spent 6 years wearing a badge that once failed the people who most needed it to succeed, and 3 years afterward building things with my hands because I did not trust myself to try again. This summer, you gave me back a reason to believe the two could coexist honestly, law and justice both, and I do not intend to let that reason walk out of my life once the excitement of a hearing settles into ordinary days again. What are you saying, Luke Wallace?" "I'm saying I love you, plainly and completely, and I'm asking you to marry me, not because I mean to manage your store or your life, but because I would rather spend the rest of mine building things beside you, whatever those things turn out to be, than spend one more day pretending I could be content building them alone." Virginia felt tears rise, unexpected and entirely welcome, and crossed the small distance between them without hesitation. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Luke, 1,000 times yes, and I want you to know I am not saying it because you rebuilt my store, though I will love you a little extra for that particular kindness until the day I die. I'm saying it because you have never once, in all these months, asked me to be less than I am to make room for you. That is rarer than gold in this county, and I am not foolish enough to let it walk away twice refused." They were married 3 weeks later, in the finished mercantile itself, the whole valley crowded inside and spilling out onto the boardwalk, Ingrid Jorgensen's baby sleeping through the ceremony in her mother's arms, Amos Fielding, fully recovered now, standing as Luke's witness with the quiet pride of a man who understood better than anyone present exactly what this marriage had cost and earned to reach this day. Reverend from the traveling circuit performed the service, and when it came time for Luke to kiss his bride, the whole room broke into applause loud enough, Virginia would later swear, to be heard clear out at Willow Creek. But it was not, in the end, a story that ended with settling quietly into the life they had fought so hard to secure, because 2 months after the wedding, a letter arrived from Inspector Ashford himself, forwarded through the reopened district land office now under honest management, offering Luke a permanent commission as deputy marshal for the entire river district, tasked specifically with overseeing the honest survey and settlement of the new branch line's true route, a route that would over the coming year, bring fair and legal growth to a dozen small towns just like Cedar Springs, provided someone with both a lawman's eye and a builder's patience helped see it done right from the very start. Virginia read the letter over Luke's shoulder twice before either of them spoke. It would mean travel, Luke said carefully. Months of it likely, riding the new route as it's surveyed, seeing fair notice given to every family in its path, making certain no second Sela's crane ever gets the chance to do what the first one nearly managed here. And the store, Virginia said. I would never ask you to close it or leave it if your answer is to stay. Virginia looked around the mercantile. At the counter Luke had planed smooth with his own hands. At the shelves stocked full again. At the town outside the windows going about its ordinary drought-weary business, with a future secured now that had nearly been stolen from it. And felt, quite suddenly and clearly, exactly what she wanted her answer to be. Ingrid Jorgensen has been asking me for weeks whether I'd consider training her eldest girl to mind the store and learn the midwife's trade alongside me, Virginia said slowly. She's a steady, capable child, nearly grown, and I have always thought this valley could use a second pair of trained hands besides my own, especially with more families coming as that honest new line gets built. If I leave the store in good hands here, properly minded, there is no reason I couldn't ride that new route myself, delivering babies in every fresh little town that line brings to life, while my husband makes certain the surveys stay honest and the water claims stay fair. Luke looked at her with an expression somewhere between disbelief and pure joy. You would leave Cedar Springs. I would leave it well tended and return to it whenever the road brings us back this way, which I expect will be often, since I have no intention of letting either of us forget where we built our life together first. But Luke, I did not fall in love with a quiet carpenter so that I could spend the rest of my days standing still behind a counter while he rode off doing good in the world without me. I fell in love with a man who taught me that accepting help does not mean losing myself. I mean to return the lesson, riding beside you, the same as I always have. They left Cedar Springs on a bright morning 3 weeks after that. The mercantile's counter left in young Greta Jorgensen's careful, capable hands, Amos Fielding installed as the town's new, honestly appointed land agent to make certain no fraud ever again crept quietly through its books, and the whole town turned out to see them off, waving from the boardwalk of the store that fire had once tried to take from them, and love and stubborn labor had raised back stronger than before. Virginia rode astride, her midwife's satchel packed fresh behind her saddle, Luke beside her with his badge pinned bright against his vest, and a carpenter's tool bag lashed behind his own. And as Cedar Springs fell away behind them into the shimmer of drought-pale prairie, she reached over and took his hand, reins loose in the other, and felt no fear at all in riding toward whatever unfinished, unbuilt future waited for them somewhere out along that honest new stretch of track, because whatever waited there, they would meet it exactly as they had met everything since the night a wounded messenger first fell from his horse in front of her door. Together, with clear eyes, and with love enough between them to build anything the world required, one honest, well-measured board at a time.